Russell. I am the Principal Director of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs. I would like to welcome you to this latest webinar in our series. This time, we are going to delve into a subject that is very important and very timely as we come into not only an election season, but news coming out of Europe, Asia, etc. We're going to talk today about a possible new Cold War, or as many are calling it, the Cold War 2.0. With us today are two very distinguished panelists joining our roundtable. Let me start with, obviously, ladies first. Suzanne Massey. Miss Massey is a fellow of what is now the Davis Center. Suzanne, correct me if I'm wrong, that used to be the Harvard Russian Research Center, is that correct?
That is correct. I was there for 12 years.
Yes, and she has lectured widely in the United States before academic, military, business, government, and public affairs groups. She is studied and been involved with the Soviet Union and Russia, U.S. relations for now almost 40 years, which is amazing. Suzanne Massey, thank you very much for joining us. And I can send you. And joining us also, he is the retired U.S. Marine, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He is currently a senior research fellow for defense programs at the Heritage Foundation and is the editor of the Index of U.S. Military Strength, which is an annual assessment of the U.S. military. He holds a degree from the Naval Academy and the Naval War College. He is a longtime military strategist. He's served as a strategist for Marine Corps Special Operations Command and currently serves as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, as I pointed out. Joining us, Dakota Wood, my dear friend. Dakota, always good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you. Good to be with you there, Justin.
Oh, thank you. Housekeeping note, as always, if you are on the program, which we welcome everybody, thank you for joining us. For our friends who are tuning in on Zoom and Facebook Live, we appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us on our webinar. We ask that you please stay on mute. We will go for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open up to questions from the audience and the participants. If you do have a question, you can send, if you're joining us through Facebook, you can send your question to info@nycfpa.org. Or if you are on the Zoom link, you can go into the chat feature and we will take the questions off the chat feature. I will read them and we will get going that way. Let's just dive right into it real quick. And what I was hoping to do is to look at the past, how the Cold War kind of developed from the way we knew it after the 1917 revolution, going all the way up until the fall of the Soviet Union, that awkward Boris Yeltsin time, and then into what we look at as the current state. But let's look at what everything looked like before. And Suzanne, I'd like to get your take on this. The Cold War as we know it started in 1945 with the tension between how Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe, were dealing with the aftermath of World War II. I guess the question would be, on your understanding, why was that such a pivotal time, and what actually led to greater tension or smaller tension between two allies that fought against Nazi Germany?
Well, I'm interested that you asked because I really don't know exactly. I mean, 1945 seems a long time away. I came into that much later. I went to Soviet Union, I mean, I write books, as you know, that's what I do.
Right.
And with my former husband and late husband, Bob Massey, we did a book, Nicholas and Alexandra. We always have been historians, and I have been specifically interested primarily in the Russian people, not in politics.
Right.
And that is why, and I didn't go to Soviet Union until 1967. Which
Okay. Fair enough.
Why I came in late on that because we were working on books, and also I had a son who had hemophilia, so I was pretty busy.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Fair enough. Fair enough. Dakota, can you take a shot at that? Knowing your panache for history, particularly military strategy and political strategic history?
Yeah, I think we tend to view big events, geopolitics, as some kind of weird world where normal rules don't apply, and what we really should do is look at the relationships between states in the geopolitical realm. It is just a bigger manifestation of how people interact with each other in homes or in sports teams or in local communities, right? So you have pride, you have ego, you have greed, you have compassion, personal interests, the interests of your tribe or clan or family, and they just roll out on a bigger stage. So after the revolution that you mentioned, that brought the Soviets to power as we understood them during the Cold War, there was very much a political agenda, a political ideology, but it also is the case that when people get into positions of power and influence, they like to stay there, right? And this greed, a desire for more, you want to expand your power base. And so the Soviets wanted to continue to expand the revolution, expand at its core what great Mother Russia was. And I'm sure Suzanne has a great insight into that. But this sense that history was for the making of the Soviet Union and to expand its control over adjacent peoples, to gain arable land, industrial power. I mean, this was a global heavyweight, right? That they had spent millions and millions of lives fighting against the Nazi regime, and Europe was rightfully theirs to then influence or control. And on the other side, you had the United States and the Western powers with democratic forms of government, free market capitalism, a different values system, personal individual liberty and freedom. And these two systems clashed, and you had great clashes between personalities, between Stalin and Churchill and FDR and then later Harry Truman. And so these lines of power and influence and control unfolded there across Central Europe. And the Eastern European states were under the Soviet sphere of influence, and the Western European states were part of the Western Bloc with the US in its lead. And then over the ensuing decades, this kind of titanic struggle between competing systems. Who is the dominant global influence? Who dictates the course of human events and all those sorts of things. So it's very much a human story. And the cultural insights that Suzanne really brings to the fore are the underlying tableau, right, of geopolitics. You just have pulling levers at at higher levels of government.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because Suzanne, going back to your point, as far as the understanding of the Russian people, and even then, I guess it's safe to say the Soviet people. When we look at how the mindset of the Soviet leading into the Russian people, have you noticed a change in their mindset on how they look at themselves and how they look at us as an adversary when we go through the years, going from Khrushchev to Brezhnev to Gorbachev to Putin? Have you seen that change?
Well, today's Russia, now, I certainly have. But the point is this. Number one, the biggest mistake that we made I think, in our Cold War, our side, I mean, just popularly, is we began to use Soviet Union and Russia as a synonym. So that now still sticks in the heads of some of the people, and it's very bad because they are very different. In fact, the worst thing one could say when there was a Soviet Union, and I was there then, is he is a Sovietsky человек. That was an insult. It's the worst insult. And I once asked, what is the difference? And I was told, well, Soviets cheat and they're bad and they're this and they're that. And I'd say, well, what about a Russian? And they'd say, oh, good. The Russians are good. They're generous. They're this. Never in the minds of the people was there ever that division that we had here, that Soviet and Russia were the same thing. They were not, and they are not. And now Soviet no longer exists, and we're still locked in that, I will say, I think very false Cold War, because we're not really having a Cold War. We're having one that's getting to be a hot war. And frankly, right now, Russia is such a different country. We have done no investigation into that country, nothing but, insults to Putin, and just all the time thinking of Russia as Soviet, and it is not Soviet. That is.
Well, let me touch on that for a second with Dakota, though. Going to Suzanne's point, Dakota, the idea that there was and still is, particularly that the Soviet Union has collapsed after Gorbachev, but the idea that the Russians were still Russian, but the Soviets were looked at as a bad mechanism of power. The two questions I have for you is, one, was the Cold War necessary in the state that we knew it between Khrushchev leading up to Gorbachev? And two, how much of a dynamic was the Cold War in maybe shaping the Russia that we know today?
Well, I mean, Suzanne is going to be very familiar with Vasily Grossman and Life and Fate. And he did a masterful job at talking about the corrupting nature and influence of the Soviet, right? Of the political apparatchiks and the people who were kind of calling the shots. And to her point, it was very different than Russia, ancient Russia, the Russian people at the core. So it really didn't matter how Russian you were to the Soviet hierarchy. It was how closely you aligned with whatever the party wanted, the Soviet to be, right? This identity to be. So whether or not the Cold War was necessary, it wasn't really. I don't think that's the right way to characterize it. It just was. You had these two competing systems: Soviet communism and free Western liberal democratic societies with representative governments, and they were irreconcilable. So the US, the construct of NATO, Western Europe, standing against further Soviet expansionism, you had to draw a line someplace, and that line constituted East Europe from West Europe. And so the nature of a Cold War, meaning that with the two sides aligned militarily, and then with the political posturing and the economic models that were in contest with each other, it prevented a hot war from breaking out, where tanks were actually firing at tanks. And there were some pretty close run instances where the cold was going to shift hot very, very quickly. The Soviets viewed world domination. They wanted to see the expansion of their power and influence. That's why we saw them in Cuba and places in Latin America and certainly Southwest Asia, where they would facilitate or fund or support various groups that would have their alignment with Moscow and the Soviet Kremlin, right, as opposed to Washington, D.C. and Western capitals that the West represented. So this Cold War construct was really a static element with some dynamism in kind of secondary theaters where these two systems were pushing against each other. And if the West hadn't stood up, you would have seen the Soviets push further across Europe and exert as much authoritarian control as the fascists did out of Italy or the Nazis did out of Nazi Germany.
Well, going off of that, Suzanne, looking at how we've gone from the old Soviet Russia through to Gorbachev, how have the Russian people adapted to that change, going from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin as we know Russia today?
Well, number one, there is a brand new, well, I can't say group, but that's Russia, and I say Russia, is now a young country. We are an old country. It is very, I mean, anybody who goes there, and I go there very often, what you see on the streets is that you see young people and young men, and even the announcers on the television are young, and that's the first thing that you strikes. There are young men now pushing baby carriages, which you never saw before. The whole place is different. It's just different. I object very much to the fact that our country, and I will say stupidly, does absolutely no investigation of this new generation. That new generation, by the way, just an interesting small point, but when Putin announced his new, constitution, I happen to know Putin slightly, and I happen to know some things that are interesting about that. But in fact, what happened is that the first top guys, like Lavrov and Shoigu and all that, stayed where they were. But the deputies, and anybody who knows the system in Russia knows that the deputies are very important. And so the deputies, every single one of them, were under the age of 50, mostly 39, 30, and 35, 40, and we don't know any of them. And they have had a completely different education. Most of them, if you realize that after all, it's 30 years ago since the Soviet Union collapsed, were young then, babies practically. Now they're in their, 30, 40, and they've had a completely different education. Number one, most of them are religious, which is very important. And now the churches are absolutely stocked full in Russia. And also they've had a different education, because now there are museums in Russia where you can see all of their history, which is very important in my view, being a historian, all the tsars, all the things. So they are educated differently. They traveled, they have seen things differently. And yet we have done no investigation. We have not, some of them are heads of corporations now, big corporations, and they're not oligarchs. They are a different group. We don't know them at all. Zero. We haven't even done what I would consider basic study of who they are. I happen to know a few now, and I see how they are operating, and they are operating differently. This is women and men. So this to me is the most thing right now that's important for us to look at, because if we don't know who they are, and we're in the business of starting a second Cold War, it's about time that we did. And it's about time that we stopped being blind and doing nothing but speaking badly about Russia, and realize that there is a new world out there that we do not know.
Well,
Justin, I'm going to jump in though on what.
Yeah, go ahead, Dakota.
So this differentiation between old Cold War and possible new Cold War, right? They are
right.
Completely different worlds. And the point that Suzanne is making is really important to understand, that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the United States, it was the happy decade of the 1990s. Bill Clinton and saxophone playing, and the IT sector, Silicon Valley making money hand over fist. And our chief concern in a foreign affairs standpoint was really whether Japan was going to buy the United States. There was all this money coming out of Japan, buying up real estate and companies and all those sorts of things. So within the US diplomatic and intelligence communities. And within the US military community, we got rid of all of the Sovietologists. These people who had spent decades trying to understand Soviet leadership hierarchies, personalities, backgrounds, the dynamics, who was standing next to who on some platform, and who was getting funding for some private, house outside of Moscow, or all that. All that was done away with during the Clinton administration in the 1990s. And then when a short 8 years later or so, 9 years later, when we had the terror attacks in September of 2001, the entire establishment was full on counterterrorism.
Right.
Who is Al Qaeda? Who is this guy living in a cave, in Afghanistan? And so
Right.
it was full on engagement of terrorism and protection of the United States against terrorism. And so from 2001 until today, almost 20 years, our intelligence community and a lot of the military establishment has really been focused on the Middle East and South Asia, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency types of operations, and all that stuff. And we had to brief, a bit where we were worried about criminal narco cartels coming up out of Latin America. And so there was some attention by the DEA and FBI and others to look at that as well. But this idea of really focusing on foreign leaders just went out the door, and all that body of knowledge left. And then with the rise of China, you saw this scramble to try to focus on what's happening in Beijing. Meanwhile, Putin comes to power, and this whole new generation of leaders and entrepreneurs and industrial power, folks there in Russia has come into being. And we just really haven't been able to carve out, because just like in our own personal lives, real quick, you only have so much time.
Right.
You have so many people in an organization. And so if 80% of your effort is looking at terror groups like ISIS and Hezbollah and Al Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan and those sorts of entities, you just don't have the resources to apply to learning about what's going on in modern day Russia and in Moscow. So we have a real blind spot there. You can't invent that overnight, and it's going to take a while to sort out who is who in modern Russia.
Well, let me go to Suzanne. Basing off of Dakota's point, if in fact we don't know the Russian people, the Russian culture, and we haven't really embraced what exactly is happening inside Russia, all we see is Putin. Putin is bad. Are we? I guess the right question is, why do we villainize Putin? I guess is the right question. Why do we villainize the leadership in Russia? We look at Putin as being very nationalistic, very authoritative. We keep hearing he's old school KGB. Why do we villainize that?
Well, I happen to think that this is wrong and ignorant, and also we have never, in my knowledge, ever attacked the president of any country the way we have attacked Putin. I don't want to get into talking about Putin because there's a lot to say, but nevertheless, I think that we have a group here, I don't know who they are, but who really, really make it their business to make Russia an enemy. And in fact, we've been hearing it in the latest election. Mr. Biden has found nothing to say about the Russians except that they kill our soldiers on bounty, which happens to be a lie. And nevertheless, that is the only thing that our present person who wants to be president knows about Russia. That, and we're always talking about how Nancy Pelosi keeps talking about how our country is run by Putin. Absurd, absurd, absolutely absurd. And for instance, Putin, after all, was the first to offer us help when we were attacked at 9/11. He has made entrances, but we don't want to talk about Putin. What I do and what I have been doing for now almost 45 years is I am studying people. because that is what I'm interested in. I am not so interested in leaders. I know a lot about the Russian people, and I know a lot about the American people. Number one, I know about the American people because I have lectured in every single state except Alaska and Hawaii. And I have also lectured to 3 army colleges, war colleges. And so I've heard an awful lot of different kinds of Americans. No American American public have I ever heard saying that they wanted war with Russia. None of them have come out with all this stuff that we keep reading in our newspapers. None of them. All of them would like better relations. Now, and what I've mostly noticed is how curious they are about Russia. Very curious, and how little they really know. So that's that. And the Russian people, I know them very well too. They used to absolutely idolize us. They don't now. They don't. They know us better now. But they used to. But nevertheless, still, America keeps a great deal of attraction.
So, Suzanne, along those same lines, would you call? We keep hearing the Russians are nationalistic. Would you call them a nationalistic people?
I think, if I may quote Professor Mersheimer, whom I happen to admire greatly, he says every country is nationalist, and every country is the most natural thing in the whole world for every country to want their national resources, their national ways, their culture, every one of them. And it is going on not only in Russia, but in Europe, big time. I happen to be Swiss. I have a double nationality. Every country in the Swiss always have refused to go into any sort of EU or anything like that. And well, that's why they're so prosperous. But in any case, and it's more natural than anything for normal people, Italian, French, I don't care who they are, to not want to be ruled by bureaucrats from Belgium. So that's happening all over. And so, yes, in that way, Russians are nationalistic. It's not bad. They're proud of their country, very proud. They're very proud of their culture. Their culture is fascinating, and we love it madly. When you know that, I have to tell you a funny joke, but traveling around, I was talking about this, and one of the things that's become an American custom is everybody has to take their grandchildren or their children to the Nutcracker for Christmas. Everybody goes. It's now as American as Santa Claus. All right. And guess what? Many Americans think Tchaikovsky is American just because of that. That's what I found. So who's nationalistic? I mean, yes, we are most nationalistic country in the world. We're always people say we're the essential country, the only essential country, that we're the greatest country in the world, that everything that we do is better than anybody else. You hear that every single day. Now, is that nationalistic? Yes. Yes, I think it is. So yes, the Russians are nationalistic, but that doesn't mean warlike. That the Russians are proud. They are glad to have their culture back, and they have done very well with it. I mean, it's very important. To them, it is their, you see, people, even people who are not religious in Russia, still speak like, if you want to say, a religious person, I mean, a pravoslavny, because it's part of their culture. And their culture was taken away from them by the Soviets. And I will end with one little thing that always interests me. After all, the Soviets were around for 69 years. That's a drop in the bucket for a country that's had over 1,000 years of history. They withstood 250 years of Mongol domination and came out more Russian than before. And the same thing is happening now that the Soviets have left. They were foreigners to the Russians. So yes, I answer yes. I wanted to explain, though, nationalism, which seems to be, well, in every country, certainly in ours.
Dakota, I go to that same line to you though. Are we mistaking, big time Russian nationalistic pride for aggressive nationalism to the brink of creating what may or may not be a new Cold War going in the future?
Well, I think we need to differentiate the people from a government, right? So just as Suzanne pointed out, the Soviets imposed their political ideology on the Russian people, the Ukrainians, and many others that came under their...
But talking about today's Russia.
Yeah, no, that's my point, though. So differentiating the political hierarchy from the people that the political hierarchy is governing. So I echo Suzanne's point that any people who live in a country are very proud of their history, of their language, and the food, and all the things that they do, right? The achievements that they have had over the years. But that does not mean that whoever is sitting at the pinnacle of power, in this case, it's Vladimir Putin, because he's a person, doesn't have other aspirations as well. So it's been under Putin's tenure that they seized Crimea, that they're supporting separatist movements in Ukraine, that they saved Bashar al-Assad in Syria, right, for geostrategic reasons, that they have been probing the northern frontiers of our NATO allies up in Norway and the Baltic Sea, that they engage in misinformation campaigns among the Baltic states. I mean, all these things are going on. You can see the problems that Lukashenko is having in Belarus and whether or not Russia is going to help support him coming in. Now, by Russia, I mean the Russian government under Vladimir Putin. So
right.
There's a difference between the aspirations and the activities of the Russian government under Putin and what the Russian people are wanting, right? And I think when we talk about Russia, it's in what context. If it's in a government to government thing, usually you're talking about one government talking about or to another government. But what I've seen from political officials in power or who are contending for power here in the US, usually they try to differentiate the United States engagement with the Russian people as different than the US government's interaction with the Russian government. So it would depend on what we're talking about and how we want to make sure that we are clearly differentiating the two.
Right. Well, let's talk about the Russian government right now, and then I want to go back to Suzanne and talk about the people. Dakota, I want to talk about this new tension that we're seeing between Washington and Moscow. Specifically, the talk of a heightened arms race possibly starting. We have the START treaty that expires next year. We have several other, we have clear skies that we've already pulled out of. Are we artificially creating a tension between Russia and Moscow, or is in fact these are the beginnings of a new arms race that we could be seeing?
They are a natural reaction to observed behavior. So if you and I had an agreement, right? We're going to have a cookout. I'm supposed to bring the hamburgers and hot dogs, and you're going to bring the buns and mustard. I show up with the hot dogs and hamburgers, and you don't show up with the buns and mustard. Do we have an agreement? Or have we violated that in some way and you're not showing up? So when we look at arms agreements between the United States and the government of Russia, the observed behavior has been serial violation of that agreement, primarily on the part of Russia. What kinds of weapons are they developing? How are they fielded? What's the count of launch and delivery systems? The creation of new and modified nuclear weaponry as well. On the open skies you were talking about, if the United States was wanting to run certain flights, but then the Russians limited those things to a specific distance or area, who is in violation of what? And so that causes, on the US side, this question about, but I thought we had an arrangement. Apparently we don't. So you can either continue in that unequal relationship, or you can try to talk the other person to coming back into full compliance. If they don't, then your response is to let that go, or you respond in a way that says there are consequences to this. So if Russia isn't going to be compliant with the Open Skies Treaty, then there apparently isn't a workable treaty, and you decide that we're at the end. On New START, if Russia continues to develop and field new nuclear systems and delivery and warhead type and all that, then we need to have another discussion about this arrangement. And on New START, where the US position is, the US-Soviet agreement on limitations of inventories was only relevant to those two countries. When you see the rise of China, China isn't obligated or restricted by anything that the US and the Soviets, or now the US and the Russians, were involved with. So they are developing intermediate and short range systems that would be in violation of New START, but they're not part of New START. So the US point is, if we were going to have limitations on our military capabilities, those limitations can't be applicable to just Russia. We now have to account to another major player on the global stage and renegotiate or talk about a three-way arrangement,
right?
The development and fielding of new weapons capabilities, are accounted for by everyone involved.
Well, let me just tag up on that one real quick before I go back to Suzanne. Along those lines, we just saw recently that the U.S. had said that if we do a New START treaty, China's got to be part of that. It's going to be a trilateral. Moscow and the Russians have come back and said, okay, we can play that game too. There's only a deal that comes to the table, and we can renegotiate if the British and the French come to the table as well. Is that a death nail in the negotiations to have a pentalateral agreement as opposed to just the traditional, as we knew it even through the Cold Wars, the bilateral Moscow-Washington agreement?
Yeah, well, I think it's never appropriate to say something has failed before it even gets underway, right? So, deals get struck at the last moment. We need to see how COVID is affecting economies. We need to see trade relationships. For example, Germany, it is dependent on Russia for the provision of natural gas, right? Because Germany's policy has been they don't want to explore nuclear energy. So now you're dependent on coal, natural gas, and oil. If one of the biggest providers is Russia, you have an economic component there that you have to account for when you're talking about security issues. Similarly, for Germany, its single largest trading partner is China. So when the United States wants to talk to our European partners about 5G technologies, the encroachment of China into European markets, and all the political influence that comes with that, we want this kind of group hug with our European allies, but many of our European allies have other interests that pertain to economic growth and opportunity, and the compact they have with their own people in terms of social services and those sorts of things. So at one level, you can say a multi-actor arrangement that is looking at nuclear and other types of weaponry, but all of those actors are also concerned about their own domestic situations, what their own people are wanting in terms of economic viability, et cetera, and how the energy trade relationship enters into that discussion. So this is a multifaceted, complex thing, and you don't quickly get from where we're at today to some kind of New START treaty in 3 or 4 months, right?
Right.
I mean,
It's not reality.
And it just has to evolve while everybody is doing their maneuvering and discussing and who's ready to do what at any given point in time.
Right. Suzanne, before I get back to you, I just want to let everybody know that for those that are participating, you can send your questions to info@nycfpa, or if you are on the line with us on the Zoom link, you can type your questions. Just let us know who the question is for when you type in your questions. We'll go ahead and get those started right now. But Suzanne, I want to go to you. When we talk about the relationship with Russia, there's two questions I have. The first question I have is, we talk about, or we see in the Western world, a lot of talk about the evil of these oligarchs. Yet, are we misreading that, or are we manipulating that? Are the oligarchs not really evil? Because to me, in some instances, our J.P. Morgans or our Cornelius Vanderbilts are the modern day new free market what we would call oligarchs. Are we
You disappeared.
Justin, I think we lost your audio there for a bit.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Ah, there we go. We're back. Okay. Sorry about that, Suzanne. Please continue.
You were continuing. Now, may I just go back a little bit?
Sure.
I want to say, as we say in French, chapeau, which is my hat's off, to the tremendous knowledge of Dakota in areas which I know less. I would say that I wish we could, just by ourselves, have a wonderful discussion about all this.
I think we can make that happen, Miss
Point
Massey.
of view about, I would love that, because I don't agree with what he said about, and you went so quickly I couldn't even write it down, but about what you're seeing. After all, rests in being able to see and understand the other side. And when you said, you gave a list of what they were doing that was wrong from our point of view, I could make that list completely the other way and make you see what's wrong, what the Russians think is wrong. Now, who is right is another question. That is diplomacy. But we simply don't, we seem to take, our instinct is always that we are right and they are wrong. That is the way it looks in everything. Now, I bow to your really much superior knowledge of weapons and all of that. I happen to be very interested because I spent a great deal of time with West Point, a great deal, and lecturing to the military, whom I happen to really respect very, very, very much. I really do, and I consider myself very lucky that I did, because I used to lecture at West Point, and I mean, now some of my friends there are generals, and it is wonderful to hear your point of view. I learned a great deal from the military, and I would love to be able to have a private conversation with you about this, because I mean, I don't know anywhere near as much as you do about the weapons situation, but I fear those weapons. We have more atom bombs than anybody in the whole world. And I mean, thousands of them. Russia takes 1/15 of what we spend. They have 1/15 of what we spend on military. We have the largest military budget in the top countries. Now, I don't happen to approve of that. And I also don't happen to approve of endless war. I just don't. I don't think it's good for the people, either people. And we're not talking about Russians right now, our people.
Right.
I think endless war, 79% of the American people would see it end. And yet we keep wanting to make more bombs, more this, more that. One bomb is plenty.
Well,
and so I just want to take you up on that, number one.
Right. Okay.
So, listen, can I ask you out for a date?
Are you talking to Dakota or me? I'm hoping you're talking to Dakota.
Dakota.
Absolutely.
Just so we could discuss it. I really would, because I have huge respect for your knowledge, and I love the Marines.
Yeah, no, I tell you, with Suzanne there, Justin, I mean, her point about perceptions, so obviously U.S. perception on that. But if I'm sitting in Moscow and I see the continual expansion of the number of countries in NATO,
right?
I see U.S. forces in the Middle East, and I see U.S. forces, in the Western Pacific, and the U.S. presence in South Korea and Japan. From a Moscow perspective, you can really view that as encirclement, right?
Right.
So you're going to try to push back some of that stuff. So it is this competition of perspectives, and how Moscow views the world and its interests, how Washington, D.C. views the world's and United States interests. Okay. So, but the point to that is one side can't sit down and just allow the other to kind of run roughshod. That's why we have these competitions, why the Cold War was stalemated the way it was in along the center of Europe. And if there is some kind of a new competition between the United States and Russia, it has to do with these competing interests. I mean, interests are eternal, right? So
Right.
what is the Russian government's view of the world, the status of its people, economic opportunity? Does it feel like it's being hemmed in? Hence the importance of dialogue. And Suzanne's very first point about having expertise within the US architecture, both in our diplomatic corps, State Department, the intelligence community, military professionals. Do we in fact understand the motivations and the aspirations and the objectives of those who are in Moscow or not? And if you don't understand, you can easily miscalculate or do something that precipitates a conflict that nobody wants to begin with, right? So it's this dialogue and this discussion, the nature of the cultural and historical work that folks like Suzanne do. And we are missing a beat there in trying to develop that level of understanding. And, again, it has to do with limited time and resources. How many challenges is the United States dealing with? And are we devoting sufficient attention to the vast array of interests that the US has as a global power?
And Dakota, we've got a question for you from one of our audience participants. In fact, it's from one of our board members. In regards to arms control agreement, there's an interest to know how impactful the U.S. withdrawal from the INF has been on U.S.-Russia relations and what the future prospects are after the election.
So this always has to do with where you stand on a particular personality or how you view U.S. engagement with the world. So these agreements, we were part of the Paris Climate Accords. We were part of the Iran nuclear agreement. We were part of the intermediate range nuclear forces agreement. But to my earlier comment about if the other side isn't playing the game, you can either allow that to continue, right? If that agreement was put in place initially because of a political philosophy or agenda that the next administration doesn't agree with, okay, what are your options? You can either try to renegotiate, you can show displeasure by withdrawing and try to get them back into some kind of a new discussion point. So on the INF treaty in particular, the Russians were habitually in violation of that.
But did we keep our promise as well? Were we keeping up our side of the deal?
Yeah, as far as the INF goes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we've written extensively on the state of affairs within the U.S. nuclear warhead and delivery vehicle arsenal, and how that really hasn't been paid attention to for many, many, many years, where we have seen developments and fielding of new capabilities in clear violation of the INF protocols by the Russians. So again, you can wag your finger at them. You can impose sanctions of some type. You can restrict travel of Russian diplomats inside the United States. Or you can just say, okay, you don't want to play by the agreement. We're out of here. That causes a lot of hate and discontent and friction. But perhaps it elevates a discussion that we couldn't have previously.
Oh, fantastic. Suzanne, I want to go to you. We've got 3 minutes, but I think since we started a little bit late, we can go probably, if it's okay with Suzanne and Dakota, we'll go a couple of more minutes. But I would like to go to you and ask, looking down the road, what and it kind of ties back to the question I want to ask is, when we look at Vladimir Putin and the Russian people, we here in the United States see the Western media talking about Putin being an authoritarian, how he derives his own power and the people submit to his power. What is the reality, Suzanne? Does Putin get his power from the people, or is Putin drawing the power and passing it down to the people?
That's an interesting question, but may I just intrude a second?
Sure.
We were talking about, are we going to a Cold War or not? Are we starting a Cold War? And this is a point I think we have to think about. Who wins a Cold War? And can it lead to war itself, which is what it looks like to me, because there's much too much talk in America about how Russia is doing this, that, and the other, and how we're going to, change it and by force. And we do have much more. So it worries me. But anyway, the Cold War business is between people too, not just between, numbers and weapons. It's the people. And we have a press that has worked consistently for many years against Russia. Somebody took a list of how many articles the New York Times had written about Russia, and all of them are derogatory except one for the whole year. The whole year. Now, I am interested in that things because I'm a writer and I look at those things. Anyway, that's number one. But to answer to your question, I do want to say this because I think we're dealing not only with the government, but we're dealing with some other, let us say, quarters of our country that are unfriendly for reasons they best know themselves to Russia, who are now trying in every way to speak. We have never insulted a president like we have insulted Putin. Now, and Putin, by the way, always refers to us as colleagues or partners. He has never insulted us, never.
But
now, I happen to object to our insulting of Putin. I can tell you, I know a lot about Putin, and we don't have time for it. But
right.
I just want to tell you that.
But Suzanne, let me jump in real quick and ask again. Let me ask it another way: are we looking? Is Putin truly authoritative, or are we misreading it?
I don't know what that means. I really don't know. Does it mean, is he a boss? What does it mean, authoritative? All I can tell you is that there is plenty of criticism in the Russian newspapers about Putin, and it goes right on. I happen to watch Russian television every night, so I happen to see a lot of things, and it's very interesting to do so, to hear them talk. One of the things that you never hear is attacks on the United States. Never. Now, that impresses me. Now, who is responsible for that? You want to think that Putin is that powerful? No. Now, all you have to see is to be there, listen to people talk, instead of not listening to people talk. What do they say? Putin has stayed pretty well respected by the Russian people. I know hundreds of Russian people of all classes, and mostly they approve of him. Now, there are many reasons for that. That's why we could have long talks about this, and I don't want to do that. Our job is, why are we having a Cold War, and what can we do about it? I don't think it's healthy for our country, and it certainly is not healthy for Russia. So what can we as individuals, and I happen to know Russia very well, and United States very well. I happen to care for you both very much. And I feel my own position for 45 years has been the same. The Russians have a lot to give us. We have a lot to give them. And what we need to do is work out a constructive relationship so that we can help the rest of the world. And we will. And that is my position. So, and that's for what I work. So I'm anti, what we're saying. I'd like to see how can we constructively improve what is wrong on both sides.
Dakota, I pose the same question to you. In your opinion, in your knowledge, is Putin deriving his own power, or is it the people that are giving him the power?
Well, even a despot has to be concerned about an uprising of the people if things go too bad, right? The number of emperors and kings have lost their heads, people rise up, right? So even an authoritarian figure,
I give you Belarus.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it has to be concerned about the domestic situation.
Right.
What Vladimir Putin has done is restored a lot of pride in the Russian public mind with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Russia was really on its back heels throughout the 90s economically, a lot of wounded pride, national pride, those sorts of things. And he restored a lot of that. And he put a lot of money into various sectors, helping the elderly, et cetera. So there's a lot of gratitude and positive views. But then again, you see some of the political stuff. This Novichok poisoning of Navalny, right? So it appears that any kind of political competitor at his level is dealt with rather harshly. Some of the oligarchs that you had mentioned, if they're not lining up with dictates from Moscow, how quickly you find charges of corruption or tax evasion or what have you, and the oligarch goes away, right?
Right.
So does appear from a very neophyte observer, not in Suzanne's class, of what goes on inside of Russia writ large, right, that any kind of political contest at the senior level is dealt with in a very strong-armed fashion. And it doesn't appear that President Putin broke a lot of dissent, very well at all. So my views of is that authoritarian or not, he seems to be calling lots of the shots and have a compliant parliamentary system, there. And we'll just see how that plays out over the next year or two. He is president for life.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, he doesn't seem to turn over power very easily, and always wants to be the top guy.
And quite frankly, he's our age, so hopefully, or not, he may have a lot of years to go. I got two last questions before we close up shop, but I do want to get to them. Dakota, I'm going to start with you first. The idea of a Cold War. We deal with the idea of superpowers. We have, the idea of the superpower came after World War II and the rise of the nuclear powers. And it was always the US, the Russian superpower, and then China came in as an economic superpower. The question is, number one, was Russia too quickly thrown into superpower status and removed it and put back in, I guess, is the right question. You see where I'm going with that, Dakota? Is going from the superpower of Soviet Russia to the transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, Medvedev, back to what many are calling the new superpower of the Putin years in Russia.
Right.
Have they been thrown around in the superpower category too easily?
I mean, it's not like that title is awarded by some kind of committee, like a Nobel
True.
like that. It's a characterization of a country's ability to influence events. So if you look at the economic throw weight of China or the economic power of Russia, its military capabilities, the fact that it does have a large nuclear inventory, it outsizes, Costa Rica, right, or Uruguay. I mean, so you've got a small ability economically, militarily, political influence to just influence your own country or one or two around you, or because of your heft and size, you have great influence on world events. So when you rise to that level, the designation has been superpower. I mean, I don't know who invented the term, but it's just a recognition of the outsized influence. So, it is the case that Russia has the most modern military it has had since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? Comparing military spending and power has to account for purchasing power parity. It has to account for the cost of labor, any kind of regulatory restrictions that increase the expense of doing whatever it is that you want to do. So you can't do a one-for-one budget comparison between the United States and Russia, right? Russia is an outsized power in its part of the world, in the Arctic, European, going down into the Middle East, but it really doesn't have a lot of influence largely in the Western Hemisphere or in the Indo-Pacific. China is a major power in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States tries to be influential in both parts. So if you're going to have military or economic or diplomatic capabilities, it has to rise to a level where you can secure your interests in more than one region at a time. So when you're going to compare, military throw weight, economic, trade relationships, and those sorts of things, it really has to bring in a lot of context in order to have these discussions, right?
Suzanne, I pose the same question to you. Is this transition from Soviet to the Boris Yeltsin years to now the Putin years, has the differences made Russia maintaining a superpower status difficult for the Russians?
Well, if I may say,
yeah, absolutely.
They don't spend a great deal of time talking about whether they're a superpower or not, unlike us. You do not hear that from the Russian people or from their leaders, Putin involved. You just don't hear such bragging about we're the superpower, we won the war, we did this. Now, look, that's just a fact. And
right.
If you read the newspapers, Russian, if you read and listen to the television, they are not talking about being a superpower ever. They're interested in other things. They're very interested in developing the country. They are very interested in peace, because peace is they have had so much war. They want to be at peace so they can grow. And I mean grow in different ways. Now, that's another, but all I can tell you is if you would go to Russia tomorrow and be in Moscow, I doubt that anybody would talk about being a superpower. I mean, I really don't. I don't think they see themselves. They see themselves as powerful culturally and across their vast country. They really do. They are very concerned about the Chinese, as we would be if we had 2 billion Chinese on our border. They are proceeding very carefully in their negotiations. One of the things that you may find interesting is that now this has been negotiated by one of those new young people. And the Chinese now get automatically television, radio, movies, everything from Russia, everything. Now, that's kind of interesting. What does that mean? What is it for? But I'm just saying, if you were to go on the streets or read the newspapers, I don't think you'd hear or read the word superpower.
Interesting.
And this is one of the differences. Now, may I also say, once again, to Dakota, I certainly appreciate your knowledge. I've learned quite a lot, and thank you very much.
We all do, Suzanne. We all appreciate Dakota's deep knowledge.
Well, and he has a twinkle in his eye that shows he's got a good sense of humor. But remember, I advised President Reagan for 4 years, and when first I met him, he called on me. I didn't call on him. He asked me, and what he wanted to know was about the Russians, and he wasn't getting anything from his army of politicos. He wanted to know about, he was an actor, he wanted to know about people and what they were really like. Now, also interesting, if I may say, there is a new book, and it's called Gorbachev's Essential Thoughts. I can recommend it. It's brilliant. It really is. Gorbachev is a really extraordinary person, and he's still around, and he is. So that is something worth looking at. But all I can say is I am interested in seeing a constructive relationship for both sides formed here, because it is not good for us, either side, to be exhausting ourselves financially and every other way with weapons. I think that's wrong, and I would like to see it improve. So whatever we can do to do that, I would appreciate.
Well, we could talk about this for another hour, I'm sure, but unfortunately we've got time constraints. I want to thank Suzanne Massey. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Dakota Wood, my friend, it is always good to see you. And thank you for joining us and being a supporter of us. Of course, I cannot go away without saying a few shout outs. Number one, this never happens without our program director, Alyssa Bonk. Alyssa, as always, thank you for putting this together. Kayla Murphy, thank you for making me look smarter than I actually am, as usual. I appreciate that. And then the rest of our team, Katya Moore, Juliana Wazinski, the rest of the team here at the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs. Thank you for all the hard work you guys do. You can check this webinar out. If you missed any part of it, you can check it out on Facebook. We'll be posting this on YouTube, and you can always see it on our website. Go to nycfpa.org. Also, check out this Friday is the premiere episode of our new web podcast. I'm sorry, webinar. Our new podcast, which is called Message Traffic. That will be starting on Friday. You can go to nycfpa.org for that, and you can also check out on your favorite sources of podcasts. As always, again, thank